Some bands arrive like a whisper and grow into something enormous over years of patient work and gradual discovery.
Good times, bad times, you know I've had my share. When my woman left home for a ride.
Led Zeppelin arrived like a detonation, fully formed and impossibly powerful from the very first note they ever played together. For over a decade, they rewrote every rule about what rock music could be.
Way down inside, I'm gonna give you my love.
How loud it could get, how deep it could reach, how completely it could consume everyone in its path. But even the most powerful force in rock history needed one song to remind the world exactly what they were capable of feeling. 1. The setup. There is a moment in the history of rock music that serious listeners return to again and again. Not because it was the beginning of something, but because it was the arrival of something that had never quite existed before. When Led Zeppelin released their debut album in January 1969, the world of rock music did not gradually adjust to accommodate them. It reorganized itself around them almost immediately, the way a landscape reorganizes itself around something geological and immovable. The speed of that reorganization was itself remarkable, a testament to how completely and immediately the music communicated something that had no precedent and required no explanation. The four people responsible for that reorganization could not have been more different from one another in temperament and background. Jimmy Page was a studio veteran, a session guitarist of extraordinary technical sophistication, who had spent years playing on other people's records before deciding that what he wanted to make could not be achieved within those constraints. Robert Plant was a young singer from the West Midlands, with a voice that seemed to operate outside the normal physical limitations of the human throat, capable of moving from a whisper to a scream within a single breath without losing any of its emotional precision. John Paul Jones was arguably the most formally trained musician in the group, a bassist and arranger whose contributions to the band's sound were consistently undervalued because they were so seamlessly integrated into everything around them. And John Bonham was simply the greatest rock drummer who had ever lived, a man whose relationship with rhythm was so intuitive and so physical that watching him play felt less like watching a performance and more like witnessing a natural phenomenon. 2. The shadow. The critical establishment never fully made peace with Led Zeppelin, which is one of the more revealing failures of rock criticism during the 1970s. From their very first album, the reviews were skeptical in a way that the audience response never was, and that gap between critical opinion and public enthusiasm defined the band's relationship with the press for their entire career. It was a gap so wide and so consistent that it eventually stopped feeling like a disagreement and started feeling like two entirely separate conversations happening simultaneously about the same band. The objections took various forms depending on which critic was making them, but they tended to cluster around a handful of recurring complaints. The music was too loud, too excessive, too indulgent, too willing to prioritize physical impact over intellectual substance. Page's guitar work was brilliant but showy. Plant's vocal style was powerful but theatrical in a way that made serious critics uncomfortable. The blues influences that ran through everything they made were genuine, but the borrowings were sometimes too direct, too close to the original sources to be entirely comfortable. What the critics consistently missed was the emotional architecture underneath the surface power. Led Zeppelin were never simply a loud band. They were a band with an extraordinary dynamic range, capable of moments of genuine tenderness and vulnerability that the critical narrative about them as a purely aggressive force made almost impossible to acknowledge. The acoustic passages on their albums, the folk-inflected songs, the quiet interludes within otherwise overwhelming arrangements, all of it pointed toward a band whose emotional vocabulary was far wider than the press was willing to credit. 3. The breaking point. The events of 1977 constitute the darkest chapter in Led Zeppelin's history, and understanding them is essential to understanding everything that followed. The band had embarked on their 11th American tour that year, the largest and most logistically ambitious of their career, playing to audiences that had grown so enormous that conventional venues could no longer contain them. Stadiums that had been designed for sporting events were being repurposed for rock concerts, and Led Zeppelin was among the handful of acts whose drawing power made that repurposing commercially viable. The scale of what they had built was extraordinary, and the distance between that scale and what was about to happen made the fall all the more devastating. But the tour that had begun with such momentum collapsed in circumstances that went far beyond the normal pressures of life on the road. The violence at the Oakland Coliseum shows in July, which resulted in serious injuries to several members of the crew and legal consequences that would follow the band for years, was shocking enough on its own. What came next was incomparably worse. On July 26, 1977, Robert Plant received news that his 5-year-old son Carrick had died suddenly from a respiratory infection back home in England. The Plant left immediately. The remaining tour dates were canceled without further explanation. The band returned to England and disappeared from public view with a completeness that suggested something more than a temporary hiatus. When they finally returned to the studio in late 1978, they were returning not just from a period of professional inactivity, but from something that had changed each of them in ways that the music was going to have to find a way to carry. The question was whether it could bear that weight without breaking entirely. 4. The return. The sessions that produced In Through the Outdoor took place at Polar Studios in Stockholm in the winter of 1978, and they were unlike any previous Led Zeppelin recording experience in ways that went beyond the obvious geographical and temporal differences. The dynamic within the band had shifted considerably during the long silence, and those shifts were audible in the music that emerged from those sessions in ways that divided listeners at the time and continue to generate debate among serious Zeppelin fans decades later. It was an album that rewarded patience in a way that their more immediately powerful earlier records had never needed to. Asking something different from its audience than physical graffiti or Led Zeppelin IV had asked. Jimmy Page's presence in the sessions was diminished compared to every previous Zeppelin album, a fact that various accounts of the period have attributed to different causes, but that all agree on as a central reality of how the record was made.
She's buying a stairway to heaven.
John Paul Jones in particular emerged as the dominant creative force on the album, bringing keyboard textures and rhythmic ideas that pushed the band toward sounds they had never seriously explored before. The result was an album that sounded simultaneously like Led Zeppelin and like something genuinely new, which created a complicated critical reception from fans who had arrived expecting the band they remembered from physical graffiti and presence. If this story is giving you chills, hit like and subscribe. The best part is still coming. 5. The song. All My Love was written by Robert Plant and John Paul Jones, a collaboration that was itself a signal of how much the band's internal dynamics had shifted during the long silence. Plant had always written with Page, the two of them finding a creative language together that had produced some of the most celebrated moments in rock history. The fact that this particular song came from a different partnership said something important about where everyone was in the aftermath of everything that had happened. It said that the grief Plant was carrying had taken him somewhere that his oldest creative relationship could not follow, and that he had needed to find a new musical companion to help him say what needed to be said. The song was written for Carrick. That fact alone gives it a weight that no amount of critical analysis can fully account for, because there is a category of human experience that music can approach but never entirely translate, and the grief of a parent for a lost child sits squarely in the center of that category. Page later expressed reservations about the song's direction, suggesting that the keyboard-dominated arrangement moved too far from what he considered the band's essential identity. That disagreement between the guitarist who had built the band's sound on the primacy of the electric guitar and the singer who needed to express something that the electric guitar could not contain revealed a tension at the heart of what Led Zeppelin had become by 1979. A band trying to hold together across a grief that had changed at least one of them permanently, making music that reflected that change honestly, even when honesty meant moving away from everything that had made them who they were. 6. The performance. The Knebworth Festival concerts of August 1979 were Led Zeppelin's first live performances in over 2 years, and the anticipation surrounding them had reached a pitch that made the events feel less like rock concerts and more like cultural reckoning. 2 shows were scheduled at Knebworth House in Hertfordshire, and the combined audience across both nights approached 200,000 people, figures that placed them among the largest concerts ever staged in British history at that point. The sheer scale of that audience, gathered in a field in the English countryside to welcome back a band that had been absent for 2 years, said something about the depth of the connection between Led Zeppelin and the people who loved their music that no sales figure or chart position could have communicated as directly. But when they played All My Love, something happened that transcended the technical imperfections of the rest of the set. Plant, standing at that microphone, singing those words to that audience, in the first major public appearance since his son's death, created a moment of collective emotional experience that everyone present seems to remember with unusual clarity decades later. The song did not need to be performed perfectly to communicate what it needed to communicate. It needed to be performed honestly, and Plant's honesty in that moment was absolute and devastating and completely unforgettable. The audience response was equally revealing. 200,000 people who had come to hear Whole Lotta Love and Kashmir and Communication Breakdown fell into a silence during All My Love that those who were there described as unlike anything they had experienced at a rock concert before. It was the silence of people understanding, collectively and without any prior arrangement, that what they were witnessing was not a performance in the conventional sense of the word. It was something more fundamental than that. It was a man telling the truth in public, and the truth was so large and so painful that the only appropriate response was silence. 7. The legacy. John Bonham died on September 25, 1980, and Led Zeppelin ended 3 months later with a statement so brief and so final that it remains one of the most dignified exits in the history of popular music. Without their drummer, the remaining 3 members announced they could not continue. There would be no replacement, no restructured lineup, no attempt to carry the name forward with different personnel. Led Zeppelin had always been those 4 specific people making that specific music, and without one of those people, the thing itself no longer existed. That statement, delivered without drama or extended explanation, was entirely consistent with a band that had always let the music do the talking and trusted their audience to understand what was not being said. That decision said everything about what the band had always been and always believed about themselves. They were not a brand or a franchise or a commercial enterprise that could be maintained beyond the circumstances of its creation. They were 4 people whose combined presence produced something that none of them could produce independently or replicate with substitutes. When one of those people was gone, the honest response was to acknowledge that the thing was gone with him. The song remains divisive among serious Zeppelin listeners, which is itself a testament to how completely it departed from everything the band had built their reputation on. But divisive and important are not mutually exclusive categories, and the songs that provoke genuine disagreement are often the ones that have touched something real. All My Love touched something real. It cost Plant something real to make it, and it left behind a document of grief and love and survival that sits at the emotional center of one of the greatest catalogs in the history of popular music. Quieter than almost everything around it, and more honest than almost anything else they ever made. Some songs endure because they are powerful. This one endures because it is true. Led Zeppelin never did anything quietly, except at the very end when it mattered most. All My Love was their most human moment, their most vulnerable, and ultimately, their most enduring gift to everyone who has ever needed music to say the things that words alone cannot carry. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us your favorite Led Zeppelin song in the comments below. We will see you in the next one.